Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second installment of Ready or Not, Leading in Uncertainty. Just going to give a couple moments, let everybody to get logged in. Really excited to share this new content really about the time we're in, and that is an uncertain time. There's been so much written, so many articles, so much going on the web, so many webinars, LinkedIn comments around uncertainty. So today I'm going to be digging into some of perspectives on what it means to be living in uncertainty and to really maximize that as a leader, as opposed to be worried about it or to be avoiding it. I have the chat open, so I might ask a couple questions and we'll be running an exchange after. So we're going to have lots of time to interact together. So one of my favorite things to do in a moment like this is to really look at words. So today I'm going to be exploring several key terms that we think of often as leaders. And one of them is the word uncertainty. What does that even mean? Here it's talking about the state of being uncertain, to doubt, and to be hesitant. And I think that, it's a word that has a connotation that's rather negative. It's the idea of weakness. It's the idea of like, if you're not certain, then if you're in uncertainty, you're sort of paralyzed in this moment, versus uncertainty is a state that we're going to all be in. And there's a way to lead in uncertainty, as opposed to uncertainty is a situation or condition of which a leader is supposed to overcome. I actually think uncertainty should be a goal for leaders versus an obstacle. Because to me, the real sort of sickness of leadership, the thing that happens as you get more and more senior in your role, is you suffer from a really bad case of certainty. So that's the firm conviction that something is the case. So I want to explore this a little bit with you now. Think of the time where you've been with people who are incredibly certain. Like, what does certainty look like when it's happening? Because I find that I've been in groups of people or with individuals who are really suffering from a case of certainty. And they usually look something like this. So what certainty is this concept that I already know everything that's happening. I have the answer. And likely I'm sharing it, or I'm just waiting for my turn to share it. We talk about this a lot when we're talking about how to listen in communication, which is there's a kind of wait your turn listening, which is like I'm pausing between my speaking to allow you to speak, but I'm not actually listening for anything except for your pause so I can start my idea. And then there's listening where I'm actually interested. So I don't know if you've ever been with someone who is really certain, and we call them closed and we call them knowing. So what does that mean? Well, I had a person who worked with me many years ago, and one of the situations was that while people were talking, instead of listening, you could watch sort of in their eyes, sort of as they were just waiting for their turn to go, and they'd be like, are you done? Are you done? Yeah, are you done? Because I have something to say. And, it's the kind of thing that you usually see more in sort of relationships with families or with partners, where people are like in an argument, just saying like, are you done yet? Because it's my turn to talk. And so in certainty, there's this idea of being closed because I have the answer. And one of the things that was really interesting in some research done on emotional intelligence was that the more, the higher your IQ, essentially the higher your intelligence is, the more certain you become of your ideas, the less you show other emotionally intelligent traits, such as curiosity or empathy. Because when you're certain you're right, just the desire to be open and listening goes away because you've got the answer. So we talk about leading in certainty versus uncertainty. Actually, see, uncertainty is a better place to be, because when you're not sure, you're open and you're learning. So think back to a time where you were uncertain. Probably it was early in your career. Feel free to say it in the chat, but you would be at a point where you don't know what's going on. So what does an uncertain person look like? An uncertain person is like, do you got a minute? I want to run this by you. As somebody's giving them some advice, they're like, wait a second, I got to write this down. This is great. They're like leaning in and they just want more. They show a hunger for information. And that's really why uncertainty propels you to learn more and to grow, whereas certainty sort of stunts you where you are. And so that's something that's really, I think, important for us to look at, because as we talk about leading in uncertainty, we're talking about almost like, how do I get past this stage back to certainty? But I think the stage of uncertainty is why so much is happening right now in the world, and so many people are getting informed and swapping articles and sharing ideas and going on webinars. It's because we're uncertain, and therefore we're learning really fast. And so learning has become a huge priority. Took a finance course few years back, and one of the things I thought was really interesting is they talked about how we sort of plan. And it says, a lot of planning is done from the caboose of the train, meaning that you're looking to the past to predict the future. So essentially, you're looking backwards and you're like, oh, so that's what just happened. And you're shouting to the conductor, that's where you need to go based on what I just saw happen. Now, that was really how most people did it. You heard people say things like, well, in my experience, or according to what I did, or when I had that role 5 years ago. And there was a tremendous amount of respect paid for the idea that because you experienced something before, you should be giving advice to the future. Well, that's not likely the case right now, because as we live in uncertainty, as we live in new work paradigms and new business challenges, it's hard not to rely on looking backwards when in fact, the windshield is much bigger than the rearview mirror for a reason. It's because you really should be looking forwards when you're making decisions versus backwards. Oh, I see I have a raised hand. I'm not sure I will leave that for Amelia right now. One of the things that my husband has been using is this idea of BC and AC, before COVID and after COVID. And so what we mean by that is, when somebody asks him, well, what do you think about X? Or what do you think about Y? He's clear to say, all right, before COVID, so he's saying, I'm looking out at the caboose of the train, this is how I would see it. Now, given that we don't know, we might not have an answer. And I find he's a scientist, this is natural for him, is to really understand that the advice or input you're giving is based on an older paradigm that may not be relevant anymore. And that's really great and humbling to do. And I've started to use the terms as well. So when getting asked a question about what we think or planning or expenses, it's like, well, are we talking BC or are we talking AC? And really, I have a lot more certainty for my BC statements than my after COVID statements. So if I'm asked, I think we'll be traveling to conferences again, do I think this? I can say, well, based on what I saw before, I would have said yes. But what I'm seeing now, I'm no longer sure. So I'm really trying to lean into uncertainty as a leader in my answer and be comfortable actually identifying that I don't have answers for the future that I had before when I was just looking through the past. So this is something for coaching that I think is really big, and I've seen it in a bunch of articles right now for leaders, which is, all right, you don't necessarily know what you're going to do, but you can plan who you're going to be. So in coaching, there's this concept of not just focusing on what you're doing, but focusing on who you're being when you're doing it. And a lot of leadership work right now is discussing the fact that we can't necessarily predict what we're doing, but we can focus on who we're going to be. So doing, this is a great way to put it, it's the actions you take, the decisions, your behavior, and all of its visible manifestations. So when we're talking about doing, we're saying, okay, what do we need to do tomorrow, next week in order to remain competitive or in order to remain, on top of our business? And then there's the being. So if you look at what this says about being, is it says it's underneath all of what you're doing. It's your qualities, your patterns, your conditioning. It's everything that you hold to be true. It's your worldview. And many of us don't actually explore who we're being when we're doing something. So if you're saying, all right, well, I'm going to be open because the world is different. I'm going to do things that show openness. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to be more collaborative with people. But who I fundamentally believe I am is smarter than everybody, more adept than everybody, having better answers than everyone. Even though I'm going to ask a question, I'm going to ask it in that way of the explain. I'm going to be like, you done? You done? It's my turn. So if I have a worldview that my experience or my knowledge or my past history is more relevant than anything anybody's saying, I can try to implement curiosity and listening. But I have to really understand that doing it is different than being curious and open. And so this is really important as a leader, is to work with your team to get really candid feedback, whether it's in a 360 or through a coach, which is really unpacking who am I fundamentally? Because if I've lived in the worldview that because I have a corner office or because I've had X number of jobs or I've been here X number of years, I have better ideas than everybody. Even if I try to lean into certain kinds of uncertainty type of behaviors, I'm still going to show up as the person who has the best answers. I love this graph here. It says, okay, this is what I'm doing. So I'm going to start asking more questions, but I have to look at who I'm being down here. And I think that what's happened in many, many organizations over the years is we've sort of put people into the superhero status, as if like somehow 2 or 3 people in the organization are capable of answering and saving all of us from our mediocre ideas. And now that we have this world where your experience doesn't necessarily make you better equipped to find an answer, we're going to have to challenge our worldview and assumption that the 4 or 5 people who've made all the decisions up until now are the best people to make those decisions alone. So again, here we're talking about in uncertainty is really focusing on not just doing all the right things that you're reading about in these articles, but doing the work to uncover if you can be that kind of person while you're doing it. I love this quote that I found in this Alex Carabi. It says, you can either try to break your own rules or you can rewrite your rule book entirely and play a different game. So this idea right now of understanding what your worldview is and what you're doing. So if you're leading a team, is to really say, all right, what has changed before to after? My worldview before was, about a certain number of growth or a certain kind of person being the right fit and all these things. And now I'm going to go back and challenge all of this myself. This is really hard to do. And it's one of the things that I bring up in a lot of my work, which is doing it as a team. So at Thoughtexchange, I've run these exchanges for multiple customers, for myself, for my teams. We run it actually quite frequently, which is we call it the outdated beliefs exchange. So if you're going to kick off any meeting where it's like, let's talk about new things, let's think about new things, let's problem solve, let's troubleshoot, let's innovate, let's sort of clean our palate. It's kind of like when you're smelling perfume and you smell coffee beans in between so that you smell the new one without smelling the old one. This is like your coffee bean cleanse, which are what are some outdated beliefs from your workplace that you're aware of that need to be updated for change to take place. You can do this about customer experience, employee experience, your business model, but really do something like this, whether you're doing it live or you're doing it remote, which is what are some of the thinking that's the before COVID thinking that we're all still hanging on to, so that when somebody comes in with a new idea, we're going to suffer from certainty and we're going to shut it down, even though that worldview is no longer relevant. So here's some. I've run this a lot about decision making, and I have to tell you, I've grabbed this from a bunch of different exchanges, and they're all eerily similar. Stop inviting senior people to meetings. It's because that ends up being the most senior person makes the decision. So again, break the pattern of having to have top level people in every meeting, because right now they're not necessarily the experts as much as the person on the ground. Suffer from groupthink, where everybody thinks that agrees with the highest person in the room. Here's another one, that leaders are the only ones who know what's going on in the company. What about this idea that the ability to disagree with the boss without feeling like you're going to, it's going into an empty void? I think I have one more here. Only a select few leaders make all the decisions. So we have a long, long history where there's a belief that whoever has the highest title in the room or on the call is the most relevant. And I think that this is something that I've witnessed many times, is you get on a call or a Zoom or a Teams meeting and the top person can't make it. The last second they cancel it. And there's like 15 really able-bodied, super smart people. And they're like, oh, well, if Tina can't make it, well, I guess we need to reschedule. As if like the other 14 of us collectively don't have the intelligence to solve anything on our own. And so that's an interesting one also, which is that why do we do that? Why do we assume that that level of person is the only person who can make decisions? That's a really outdated belief that really comes from a time of certainty, whereas in uncertainty, I would say there's a leveling off of everybody's opinion actually being equally valid because they have equal exposure to the environment and to new ideas and new thinking. What is the biggest barrier to this? What is the biggest barrier to letting go of this paradigm? Well, it's ego. Now, I know Freud wouldn't agree with this definition of ego, but the way it's used, most people say it's a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. So it's really hard to let go of the idea that I add value by being the smartest person who has the greatest view. I use it like a swimming pool. Like, I'm the one who's in the lifeguard chair. I see the whole pool. My opinion is more valid than the people swimming in the deep end because they don't see the whole pool. Well, really, that's a mistake if you're doing that as an organization. You should be able to bring everybody's perspective up to be able to see the entire pool and then ask everybody what they're seeing so that we can get the best idea of what's going on versus just your idea. It's really outdated to think that you need to have all the answers. I love this book, Multipliers. It's written by a woman named Liz Wiseman. And she had this great comment, which I love, because in her book, it's really about how do we make the room smarter and how do we realize we're inadvertently making the room dumber. And so a lot of us are accidentally diminishing people versus multiplying, the intelligence. And one of her tips for herself was this thing with poker chips, which I thought was really great, which was this idea that she realized that even though she's the author of Multipliers, that all day, all morning, people would pop by her office or give her a call asking or telling her things, and she would be giving all this advice. And she would be like, you know what, I really am not encouraging people to make their own decisions and give their input. And when I weigh in, everybody listens. So she had this idea that she'd give herself 4 poker chips in a day. And those were the 4 opinions or things she was allowed to weigh in on. And when she first did it, by like 9:30 in the morning, she'd have no more chips. And then she'd be like the next day, well, I'm not going to waste my opinion on that. I'm going to save it for something. And this is a really good, a technique I've used when I've taught decision making, which is, what are the decisions that are crucial for you to be involved in, and what are the ones that are really important you don't be involved in? And if you could only weigh in on 4 things a day as a leader, what would you weigh in on? And this would start to sort of tone down the ability for you to jump in and therefore sway the room. And in times of uncertainty, we have to stay curious and stay open as long as possible. But the bias power leads us to think that I'm just weighing in. But really, once you become a fairly senior leader, you have a team reporting to you, your weighing in is actually you pushing the decision. Now, another way I've learned about uncertainty versus certainty was actually a lesson I learned in Spain. So I was actually at a job interview, and I was very, very young. And it was translated. So I had a translator, and it was a very long day. And at one point, one of the senior leaders, I was talking, about my experience, all my caboose, looking backwards. This is everything I know to be true. And one of the concerns, one of the interviewers, when the translator told me, was they said that they didn't find me to be humble. And I was like, I'm in a job interview. You're like selling yourself as hard as you possibly can. So I was like, well, what do you mean? I have humility. And so I started debating, through the translator about, whether I was humble or not. And in the end, it was, the person re-explained it. And she said, oh, I think what he means is you're not being flexible. And so I was like, what do you mean about that? And I was like, well, there's a way of where you're talking, which is sort of like a North American view of the retail space that is inflexible and therefore not humble. And what we're worried about is that you're not going to be flexible to bring in new ways of thinking. Now, I have to tell you, at the time, I thought, well, they totally got that wrong. I thought this was like totally a mistake of translation. But over the years, I've had a lot of time to really think about the connection between flexibility and humility. And really, what kind of person is able to bend, is able to bend and think differently, is somebody who doesn't think they have all the answers, who doesn't suffer from certainty, and therefore in their uncertainty, they become humble. And I think that person inadvertently did not realize that they were teaching me a tremendous life lesson, that my looking backwards and being certain that that's how it was going to work forever was actually making me a less good leader in my future life. Just going to give you a moment to read this quote from Leadership for a New Era. So this is an article that just came out in July from McKinsey, talking about what CEOs need to do. And it's really a lot of the things we're talking about today, which are looking at the mindset that you have that gets in the way for what is possible, looking at the degree to which you're willing to challenge the way thinking is happening. So how are you going to survive is really by the ability to change yourself from closed in knowing to open and learning, to embrace uncertainty and to leave certainty behind. Because remember, you can't be uncertain and certain at the same time. You can't be both, certain and flexible. Those are 2 different kinds of skill sets. So how do we talk to leaders about really moving past this idea that a few small group of people have all the answers? This is something that I thought was really interesting that we did here, which is an exchange our CEO ran. And he ran this based on an offsite we had, which was asking all our organization what advice they had to help us in the next 18 months. And I think that's, again, showing like a tremendous amount of humility and flexibility, which is that we're at a point here where we would like advice. So it's not like, what are your thoughts or questions for us? What are your questions for us? It's as if like we have the answers. What are your questions about our strategic plan? It's like, hey, the world's gone crazy. What advice do you have for us based on what you already know? And what we saw was really interesting here was things like, this is my favorite one, challenge assumptions. We aren't the company we were 6 months ago, 1 year ago, 5 years ago. Just because it worked back then doesn't mean it's the best option. We're a fairly young organization, but it's so fast that you get entrenched in a way of thinking. that moves you into uncertainty and takes away the wonder one has when one doesn't have the answers. And then I like this one as well. Make sure that all senior management is truly listening to people who they consider subordinate, be it feedback, ideas, strategy. So it's this idea of like, you know what? We understand that we have a ton of knowledge. We understand that the world's changed. So, you know, if we start a sort of narrative that most leaders have about their experience or the company or when they had that job, people are getting to be a little bit fatigued by that. I love this over here. It's talking about prioritizing, and it's talking about making sure we're spending time on what's important and not urgent. So again, this idea of that last comment about CEOs saying, like, are you willing to let go of some of the processes and ways things are done, which are slowing people down? What we saw in these last few months is companies like General Motors or Prada pivot to change their production line to make either ventilators or masks, when before that kind of change would have taken months of meetings and time and pushback and people saying we can't. But when, you know, the agency was there, suddenly this ability to change came quickly. And that's because we took away all the barriers to getting things done fast, which was our processes. So if you can challenge your processes, you can move much faster. But that means you have to let go of your certainty that that's the way business is done. I wanted to take you into one of these really interesting articles, again from McKinsey, about the new way of working. And it really talked about 3 different things that are happening at once, which is the idea of being bold and moving fast in collaboration, and that learning really is coming from listening now. So this is the kickoff for that article, which I thought was great, is the way companies learn to adjust to today's crisis will deeply influence their performance in tomorrow's changed world. So it's like, basically, what can they do to have closer ties with their customers, employees, and suppliers? So it's like, we've got to get really close. Like before, this corporate office, and then in the corporate office, this floor or wing that just had executives in it, that's so outdated. We have to like crumble that down, and we all have to get squished together like playing sardines so that we can learn from all of each other, because we all have really important information. And I love this, playing it safe now, understandable as it might feel to do so, is often the worst option. So I thought I'd give you some examples of, you know, from Thoughtexchange, how we're trying to not play it safe anymore. One of our ways to be bold is that we have a lab. So basically, if you go into our dashboard, you see everything that's set up for you. And then if you click on this little science experiment thing, you see all the things that we're trying at the same time. And we're letting you see it in real life as it's being worked on and fixed. Now, this is different because in my old world, we wouldn't produce something for customer unless it was working perfectly. We had marketing, we had a launch campaign, we had talking points, everything had to be perfect. And it took months, sometimes 2 years for something to come out. That's done. By the time that happens, it's over. So how do you do ready now? Well, you can experiment at the pace it's happening by actually showing people your experiments and letting them work with you, and not being so concerned that it has to be 100% right versus it has to be what people need. And so by people going and playing around in here, we get a ton of data that we would take so long in the old process of, you know, you'd write it in, send an email, talk to a customer, and then escalate it to the person in product. It just wouldn't happen. So we have a testing facility that's open for everybody who uses our tool to give us that. And this is really allowing us to pilot things much faster. So before even the word pilot for us, I was part of a 2-year pilot once. Like, I'm not kidding you. Pilots should be quick. We should learn fast. We should get rid of stuff. We should make decisions. We just don't have a time to move slowly anymore, because, you know, what was 6 months ago is no longer relevant. The McKinsey article, the CEO at the moment, says that making 1 or 2 bold moves more than doubles the likelihood of making a shift. Making 3 or 4 makes it 6 times more likely. So what are some bold moves that you can make as an organization now in this time of like, let's try it, this time of embracing uncertainty, this time where leaders are actually really reaching out to their customers and their people for ideas? What are some bold moves? Likely we all know what they could be. We just felt that we weren't going to be able to do them. So when we're talking also about collaboration, we say that, okay, this network effect of collaboration is huge, meaning the more quickly learning occurs, the faster performance improves. So this goes back to this idea of speed again and collaboration. Now, typically collaboration is working groups that meet every 6 or 8 weeks because nobody's calendar is free. Well, that's because you're using all the same people for all the same projects. If you actually allow different people to collaborate at different levels, you can meet much more frequency. We also obviously use thought exchanges. So we use things like, what are creative ideas that we can use to make customers a champion of thought exchange? We get 32 people in there in 5 minutes. Get 27 ideas, everybody's weighting them, and they're all prioritized. So you get to have collaboration at a much faster level. Here's another one. We asked our customers to look at our beta product and tell us, give them their feedback. And guess what? When you collaborate with your customers, yeah, sometimes they're not thrilled. Somebody said something here is cluttered and annoying. But you know what? That's real feedback that we got directly to us. And you can see that it was ranked number 2. So I don't need to just hear from one customer. I actually heard from 63 different customers who rated this their number 2 concern. And therefore, I know that that's something that we have to do. So you can collaborate and move quickly with your customers. You just have to let go of this fear of doing it openly and transparently, because it matters more to your brand that you're doing it quickly and you're doing the right things that your customers want than that you're doing it in a very closed and spooky way. The last point they talk about is learning is listening. This goes back to who are you being when you're doing it. So can you learn in a time of crisis? That's the one ingredient that can turbocharge your ability to scale quickly. I wanted to give an example that's really, really relevant. So when the Black Lives Matter movement was, all the activity started after May 25th, after George Floyd's murder, we ended up with a lot of customers who wanted to understand how they could use Thoughtexchange, and we aren't experts in that area. So we actually launched an exchange to our customers saying, what's the most important things we can do at Thoughtexchange to assist you in your efforts? And so we asked our customers, what is it that you want from us to do? Your customers can tell you, we're not experts in what they need, they're experts in what they need. They talked about the need to have safe conversations, and they talked about Thoughtexchange is in a position to create templates that can be used. There was a real big fear that people wanted to talk about this, but talking about race at work, you might get it wrong. And it felt like it was too dangerous. So we were like, how can we help our customers? So normally, again, this might have gone into a product queue behind 5 other things that we were already doing, but this was right now, people needed it. So what did we do? Well, we listened to them. We created an exchange gallery that had on anti-racism and diversity and inclusion that had all the support tools for that. We just launched it. And then if you click on the anti-racism, you actually get 5 questions that we use some experts that we've engaged to find words and wording and questions that will really help drive that conversation in a way that you can feel safe, but also engage with your team. And this is real time. I just grabbed this from like a couple days ago, because you've got to be relevant and move fast, but we wouldn't have gotten this if we had not asked our customers, which normally is a bit vulnerable to do. So that's really about learning and listening. And we do it also internally. This is one question we asked at the beginning of the year to our executive team, which is, how do we improve our ability to hear ideas and make people feel heard? Because we understand that we shut down people's ideas with our like, is it my turn? And that we are our own enemies in our certainty to really, really getting involved in that uncertain wonder and questioning. And so here were some of the top thoughts from our exchange as a leadership team was, speak directly into the not listening comments. So when people say you're not listening, don't be like, I'm not going to listen to that, because we often hear that. And then it talked about listen intently to adapt to improvements, frame ideas and proposals in an inclusive way. So the idea was, even as a leadership team at Thoughtexchange, we still have to make sure that we actually remain open, because the desire to be closed and knowing and certain is so intoxicating for a leader. And so many people reinforce you as having the best ideas when you weigh in, that you can fall into that and therefore not maximize the issues of uncertainty. So we're getting close to the end of my piece here. The last thing I think I want to show you here is this idea of learning. So I just did some screenshots of all the exchanges that we've used the word advice or learning since the COVID pandemic began, and there's probably more, but I'm just showing you an example of so many different exchanges. And why am I doing that? It's because I want you to see that the idea of learning is that we have to get learning out quickly. So if somebody in one team is learning something, we've got to share that with other people. We have to, speed up the pace of being able to collaborate on what's working and what's not working, because the world's changing so much and we can't look at the past. So this is really our best way to predict the future, is just to look at what's happened in the last few days and to get that information shared quickly. So here's some questions maybe you want to ask in your company if you want to start to talk about being bold. This is a great question to ask. What are some bold actions we've hesitated to pursue in the past, even as we knew that they would eventually be required? There's usually a lot everybody knew could happen, but they felt like sort of chained down by our processes. So what are some of the things that we could just shed right now? Is there an openness from CEOs to look at an organization and say, I'm ready to not just change what we do, but I'm going to change who we are. I'm not going to be certain, I'm going to be uncertain now as a person. And then let's ask that question again. And if you say we've tried this, I'd say try it again. The world's changed. What about this one about collaboration? How can we better collaborate to challenge the status quo, improve product, service, and processes? So again, reach out to the outer edges, allow everybody to weigh in, and flatten out that knowledge transfer so that you can get the best answers from everybody. And a learning question is wonderful. Is what learnings and new muscles should we bring forward in the organization for the future? I grabbed that from the article. I think this is a really great question, which is like, what do we have that we didn't have before because of how the world's changed? And how do we hold on to that and turn those into the new leadership competencies? Like for me, certainty now is not acceptable. Anybody who shows certainty is actually showing themselves to be a weak leader. I want them to lean into uncertainty. So to sum it up, these are the words that I think that we need to get away from, which are really the closed and knowing way of leadership, which is where there's egos, outdated beliefs from having done or worked in an industry years and years ago, power dynamics, the idea of who should be in a meeting, who should make those decisions, working groups having to involve the same group of people all the time. To me, this is the outdated way, and that's really when you're leading from certainty. And then we move into uncertainty, which is the open and learning, which is we're really looking for humility. We're looking for flexibility. Of course, that's my lesson learned from Spain. And we're looking for leaders who are listening, not listening to wait their turn, but listening to learn. And we're also looking for leaders who are really pushing on the questions they ask so that they can get the most out of that. So with that being said, I think it's time for a thought exchange. And I will open that up in a moment here. It's going to be in the chat if I'm not wrong. And let me just grab it here. Those of you who know how to do a thought exchange, this will be no surprise. I will just tell you here, my screen just got super big for some reason. So to do a thought exchange, I don't know what's going on. I'm going to try to get it back. To do a thought exchange, you have to go into the chat and click on it. And if you're doing it here with me, I have to share again. So to do a thought exchange, to participate, all you need to do is click on the link in the chat, or if you're using your phone, you put it on camera, but don't take a picture, just put it on camera, and then click on the pop-up when it comes in, and you'll come into the exchange. And this is just a time for us to actually converse together, which I'm really excited to do. And I just want questions or comments or advice you have about leading in uncertainty. So let's get a conversation going, and we will see what questions or comments come up. I'm really curious to hear about that. And I will also check the chat or questions if I missed anything. So really interesting thoughts in here, and I'm going to grab, because there's a couple of questions here. I love the first one, which is, be brave. Don't be afraid to ask. That's for sure. It's oftentimes when people ask a question, what ends up happening is they actually kind of, they almost grieve the real answer. Because if you haven't had a lot of honesty around you, and a lot of leaders haven't, when you run a thought exchange and you see, without the bias of power or people having the psychological safety and anonymity, they tell you what's really going on. It's kind of like visiting the real department or the real company. And there's a point where you're almost angry that you asked the question, because when most people say I want feedback on an idea, they just want a compliment and people to agree with them. When someone actually gives them constructive feedback, they get really defensive, and it teaches them not to ask. So there is true bravery in being able to say, I want to know what it is. And if you ever have a thought exchange like I have, I put my own ideas in without my title or my ability to influence, and they're not always the number one thought, sometimes like the number 30 thought. And it's super humbling to go, okay, without any, bells and whistles, this is what people think about that idea. But over time, it's really made me sharpen my ability to listen to the situation, because I do want to have the number one thought, but I want to have it because it is the number one thought, not because people want to make me happy. So you're definitely right. Be ready to hear the truth, and then don't get angry when you see it. Like, just be able to say, well, I found an elephant in the room. Maybe everyone saw it but me, but how do I address it? And that really is going to elevate me as a leader. You don't need to have all the answers because you don't know all the questions. That's beautiful. You should get a t-shirt that says that. Whoever wrote this, you should definitely, I used to joke with somebody that I knew that seemed to always know everything. And I would say, that's be exhausting. Just every conversation, you have to know everything. I can just listen to a discussion and just be, in wonder about all this information. But this other person was like getting ready to quote fast, getting their phone out and checking everything. So I think it's really interesting when you can be comfortable not having to know the answers, you really can enjoy the discussion. Leaders need to be vulnerable and because I admit you don't have the answers. But I think the idea is if you act like you have all the answers right now, if you suffer from certainty, people are lowering their belief of you because by the time that we all have that person, I mean, hands up if you don't have that person in your organization. They just start talking, you're like, oh, here we go again. And they're lecturing and they're picking at something and they're telling the same story they've told 24 times. You really just don't want to be that person. I love this idea of metaphor of dancing on shifting sands. Leaders have to be comfortable with that for years to come. I think that's a really good way to put it, is that it's always going to be moving. And so the new leadership paradigm is like, how do you lead when you can't look backwards to look forwards and where people aren't interested in what you did 5 or 10 years ago to solve today's problems? What does leadership even look like? And I think anybody who's in leadership or in HR, this is a new set of competencies or skills or whatever words you want to use or traits need to be developed for people to really start to push that and push certainty out the door. Creating a safe and supporting environment in the absence of judgment. Yeah, I mean, you know, when I first started using Thoughtexchange, I got comments from people like, I don't think we should use anonymous tools. I think people need to put their name on their thing in order, you know, I'm not going to listen unless you put your name on it. And I'd be like, so says the person in a corner office, the parking spot with your name on it. You know, you get to a certain point in your career and you start making these statements that make absolutely no sense if you're like an administrative assistant, a coordinator, a manager, even a director. So you have to understand positional privilege. Whenever somebody tells me we don't need anonymous ways to give feedback, I always say, you know, comes with your title, this statement. Let's go down 3 levels and ask who would agree with that. So positional privilege is something we have to be very aware of. And when we talk about, you know, things like radical candor or about, you know, assigning your name to something, it's typically coming from somebody extremely senior who feels extremely safe. And so I find that I'm very much, I sort of find that's one of my pet peeves. I think it's actually ridiculous. I think you should be so curious to hear what people are thinking. I'd like you to be obsessed with the ideas and not with how you got them. Get over how you got them. It doesn't matter. You know, if you're going to tell people I only listen to it one way, you're actually only going to hear a lot of agreements. You're really doing something. So I could go on forever with that. I like this one, curious, be willing to take risks. Yeah, the culture of blame has to stop. So, you know, I remember I was in an organization that was struggling. And, you know, the best thing on a Monday meeting was to find out which department was at fault for the sales of last week. Was it marketing who got the flyer out too late? Was it sales who didn't man the thing properly? Was it, you know, real estate who got us a bad location? And you were just like so excited when the blame cloud was over somebody else's department and not yours for whatever was going wrong. And this was like being on the Titanic fighting for the last, you know, life jackets. It was the worst environment I've ever been in. And why I bring that up is I think that in a culture where you're just so relieved that somebody else is being blamed, you will never try anything. In fact, you're going to spend most of your time developing a narrative where you can blame someone else. And I'm glad I went through that, you know, probably fairly early in my career, because I will refuse to work in an environment like that. If that's how we're going to start a conversation, is finding joy in the pain of others, it's not for me. So here's some good questions here. I do a few before we wrap up. How can you politically safely, even with coach, approach to help an exec that are closed and driving the caboose? Yeah, I use the caboose and closed and the whole like windshield versus rear view mirror, because I've done a lot of coaching with people, which is just the idea of understanding your narrative for people is kind of like the Grand Canyon. It's like people are trying to talk to you about a new way around the Grand Canyon, and you're just going down into these deep crevices. I think the safe way to do it is I try to honor what people do know and what is still relevant. Like, it's so amazing that we have this kind of intelligence, this kind of experience, because it's going to be so relevant for these issues. And then it's that whole BCAC. Considering where we are now, I think we need to start to revisit these things. And I think that outdated beliefs exercise, whether you use Thoughtexchange or something else, is really, really good to do, because having a leader hear people challenge their very business model as outdated can start to have a really good, candid conversation. One of the things that's really amazing is anonymous tools provide better, honest conversations, because once they're up there and they're like the top 5 issues are the very basic foundation of processes in your company, the leader then goes, oh, I didn't know everybody felt that way. And then you can say as a facilitator, all right, let's work on the first point. But the point has already been up there. It's been validated. We don't have to defend it. And I think that allows leaders, and I tell you, I have done, my couple of exchanges early on where the leader sort of held up the phone and was like, who did this? As if by asking a question, I created a problem. And then when they got over sort of their pain of seeing answers they weren't thrilled with, they really then got curious as to where they came from, and then we actually did make shifts. So I would say that it's okay if the person isn't amazing about that new paradigm at the moment. What you want to see is they change over time. Reflect on your behaviors. This is relevant. Yeah, work from home is new. All of that things, shedding old paradigms. Again, I think we have to make that something that we regularly do. We say, let's clean our palate, smell coffee beans between ideas, and let's like really look at some of the outdated ways we think. I'm going to do a couple more and then I will wrap this up. What are your thoughts on how to manage in a multi-generational environment? Well, you know, that is really hard because you don't want people to feel like their experiences are relevant. I think what's happening now is that, yeah, I should show you Slack for us. Everyone is sharing articles, ideas. It's great for you to maybe work with your senior leaders to curate maybe 3 or 4 articles a week or a webinar everybody goes on. So they can still, you know, provide guidance. These are the top articles we suggest. This is the top virtual events. This is somebody to follow on LinkedIn. And then maybe in your meetings, you actually debrief what's in that area. So there's still a sense that we're all learning together. You know, there's a you know, the comment of you can't teach an old dog new tricks. My kids used to be a huge fan of the show Mythbusters. And one of the Mythbusters is they had old dogs and young dogs, and they actually all learn new tricks. And so that's a paradigm that I think younger people have, is that old people can't change and they can't learn. And watching that dogs thing really let me know that I believe that too, to be honest. I would sometimes think, oh my God, that person's a dinosaur. I can't wait for them to be gone. And then, you know, what's happened is as I've gotten older, I've seen those same patterns reappear from people in their 30s. And I've realized that it's just a way of being that's not attached to your age. And so I think we also have to understand that we have our own paradigms about age. And then over here, the last one's, what's the best thought exchange question to start with? I'll tell you what I think, a question that uses the word advice. I saw this once for the CEO who was in a team that was really, really struggling. And the question that we designed for that CEO was, what advice do you have for Tom? Just given all the situations we discussed in that meeting. And it was such a deeply humbling question to ask. It wasn't, what are your thoughts or what are your concerns, which is sort of okay. I'd say those are mid. It was really just, what advice do you got for Tom, given the results that we just saw? And I think their whole belief about this guy being inflexible and being like a big ego vanished, because they were like, well, actually, I have a lot of advice for you. And he welcomed it all. So I would say, if you really want to move yourself from certainty to uncertainty, ask people what advice they have for you. And that really is a word that we use when we're still learning and listening versus what I was doing. So with that, we're wrapping up for today. I wanted to thank everyone for being here. I also wanted to let you know that on Thursday at this time, we're doing what we call a V-Connect, which is where everybody goes off camera. It's like the Zoom Brady Bunch style. And we do a lot of discussions. So we're going to go through some of these discussions. We're going to do little breakout groups. I will be there with our Chief Revenue Officer, Jamie Smithers. So the link has been posted in the chat, and I encourage you to sign up and share it. And we're going to have an interactive discussion where we're all going to be together, Brady Bunch style. So I want to thank everybody for joining me today, and I really want to wish you well in this new time of uncertainty. Enjoy it. Enjoy it. This is a wonderful time to be a leader. All right, take care, everybody.